Curious about how the Indian state really works, its levers of power, tech ambitions, and geopolitical maneuvers, explore it all through one of three specializations in our 12-week graduate certificate in public policy. Applications close August 24th.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
On May 25, Liberia-flagged MSC Elsa 3 sank around 15 nautical miles off the coast of Kerala. Only a few days later, a Singaporean-flagged MV Wan Hai 503 caught fire off the coast of Kerala again, and the Indian Navy swung into action for the rescue of the crew. Two such incidents happening in quick succession are not a rare phenomenon. There have been multiple such incidents in the seas and oceans surrounding India's long coastline, posing various environmental risks to marine life as well as coastal communities. Despite it being a globally well known issue, and despite India having decades of experience of dealing with the fallout of oil spills in the region, is the country doing enough? Can the current approach be refined to minimize the damages from accidents involving ships? To discuss these issues, I have with me Swathi, researcher with the Geospatial program at the Takshashila Institution, and Tannmay, who's associated with Takshashila's High-Tech Geopolitics program. I am Lokendra, a researcher with the High-Tech Geopolitics program as well. Welcome to this podcast, everyone. So, Swati, let's start with the first question, and a very basic one for the benefit of our listeners. With multiple oil spills occurring in the current year and previous years, can you explain to our listeners how severe is this problem and why something needs to be urgently done about it?
Yeah, so to start with, oil spills are actually one of the most visible damaging forms for when it comes to these marine pollution, right? Like we can talk about temperatures increasing in the sea level and all that, but this is actually which causes very tangible adverse impacts on the organisms and the biodiversity itself. And by definition, oil spill is basically release of these petroleum hydrocarbon in its liquid form most of the times. And it's mostly due to these accidents with the oil tankers, which mostly transport across the sea. To give a perspective, I think 80% of the oil movement happens through the sea and specifically the Arabian Sea region itself, which is the India next to the Indian coast. And there are actually quite a few monitoring bodies which are responsible to monitor the movement of ships or any oil spill that happen and its mitigation strategies and things like that. But at least even after having these kind of bodies or these kind of monitoring mechanisms, the incidents are actually quite intense. Like every year, at least there is an average of 7 to 8 oil tanker disaster itself, which happens majorly, of course, in the Arabian Sea and then the Atlantic regions like the US Gulf, which happens. And the most famous ones which happened in these are actually along the US coast. Like if we remember, I think in the 2010, there was incident in the US Gulf of Mexico region, which actually cost around billions of dollars, while it could be, the effect of oil spill could be resolved. It took around 3 to 4 months where all the hydrocarbon waste could be removed from the water itself. And how it impacts is, of course, the biodiversity impact, where the fishes and all the marine animals, leads to something called the low oxygen phenomena in these regions. And that intensifies and hence leading to the biodiversity death. But something which impacts the humans itself is the livelihood, right? Most of the population in the coastal regions are heavily dependent on, going every day into the sea and having this fishery as a source of their livelihood. And this gets impacted because most of the coastal lines have to be, stopped or closed for months until the restoration and all that happens. And these are also not the well to do communities or anything. It's like a daily income thing in which they're dependent on. And because of that, again, the further economical dependencies within the territory of any country also gets impacted. And also there is a lot of human life loss which can happen, because these oil tankers again include these ships which carry humans and which are having these merchant navy officials most of the time. Their life again gets impacted, and if the rescue process doesn't reach in time, which has actually happened in one of the 1989 oil spills, and even in the Mumbai oil spill, which happened in the 2000s. So, yeah, it is basically life of humans as well as the marine organisms and animals. It is the livelihood of those who are dependent on these resources on an everyday basis, and of course the overall global environmental impact itself, because the restoration process is not so easy to keep count of or even understand on a long term basis.
Thank you, Swati. I think that you explained it quite well and in quite detail. Only one quick follow-up question to that is, so based on what I understand from your response is that primary oil spillage issue happens because of oil tankers getting into some kind of mishap, right? And these oil tankers are carrying maybe thousands of or maybe millions of gallons of oil, right? The large ones. But I think around India's coast, one reason for oil spillage is also normal ships, right, which are not necessarily carrying oil tankers, maybe carrying other hazardous things, or maybe just commercial items, normal merchant commercial items. They getting into some sort of disaster and their fuel spilling out into the ocean. So is that a component as well?
Yes, very good point. So also, um, many of the countries are still importing countries, right? Largely importing countries, especially if you look at India, the major importing elements, the pesticides, the fertilizers, and every other type of chemicals which goes into the industries, many of them are still imported. So, as I said, one of the major incident in India happened that's in the 2010, and it was on the Mumbai coast basically. So it was basically a vessel called Chitra, MSC Chitra. It was called MSC Chitra, and it basically collided with the some other bodies which were nearby. And because it was carrying these pesticides and fertilizers coming into the territory, the whole ship was damaged. Personals lost their lives, and of course it was these chemicals which got into the marine body, and then the restoration process took much longer because there were a lot of fires which aligned with these disasters. So yes, especially when there are chemicals beyond these hydrocarbons, again their removal process could get complicated. How they react with these marine organisms itself might not be known so well, so we don't even know how to treat basically these things. Yeah.
Thanks, Swati. Now, one more question on the issue. One thing I've noticed in most of the reporting that comes out after such accidents or incidents happen in and around India's coasts is that multiple Indian agencies have sprung into action. So maybe it's either the Coast Guard, which has sent two, three different types of ships, or maybe some surveillance aircraft, or it is the Indian Navy if it is a bit far, right? If it's beyond maybe
Yeah.
exclusive zone, maybe into the high seas, maybe Indian Navy, and a host of other institutions located in mainland India. They
Yeah.
get active. And the news reportage will emphasize what all these great institutions are doing to tackle this very serious issue, right? So my sense was India was very proactive and dealing with these things in a very proactive way. But when I read your Deccan Herald piece that came out recently, my eyes caught attention to this phrasing, particular phrasing that you did. And I quote, critical gaps that threaten long term coastal security, unquote, right? So you're arguing that these critical gaps remain in India's approach when it deals with oil spillage issues. So can you please explain to our listeners what these critical gaps are?
Yeah. So let's take the incident which happened across the Kerala coast itself. Okay. So when the oil spill incident happened, basically the first response was, of course, from the Indian Coast Guards, who are responsible for protecting the Indian coastline and even ensuring taking disaster management steps and all that. Then there was, of course, the Central Marine Fisheries Research Institute, which is actually located in Kerala itself. And because they had a certain kind of database with respect to the coastline, they also got in when it came to the mitigation strategy. Then, of course, we have a body called the Indian National Center for Ocean Information Services, which is dedicated to, collecting database regarding ocean and other weather related phenomena that happens around, and even dissemination of this information. So there were three bodies which had to come together to ensure, and they did a pretty well job. But saying that there could have been so many other there could have been so many other delays which could have come out because of this, managing three central level organizations itself. And also, there we really lack something called, these, you would have heard that when there are these different military, right, air force, navy, army, they have these joint exercises, which is, to combine their strengths and to understand how they can work in a coordinated manner when it comes to a certain operation and things like that. That is somewhere what I think is lacking when it comes to, these marine disaster prevention and management. There is not really a coordinated exercise which comes across, and there are actually other organizations doing it. For example, the US's Ocean Observation Organization, which does these exercises with the military or with the disaster management bodies itself. And to also say that another body that we have in India is the State Disaster Management Authority as well as the National Disaster Management Authority. They actually come into place mostly when the disaster happened within the territory, right? And again, I get surprised when like landslides, which are becoming quite common in Kerala, there will be the state disaster forces which are in place, but then most of the time the Indian Army or the Indian Air Force has to come and pitch in to, ensure the rescue happens in time. So there is so much of integration that is actually possible, but only happens kind of at the last moment, which I'm not sure if it is actually resolving the problem or the crisis in a particular given time. Yeah.
Thanks, Swathi. If I can take a question now, I
Yeah.
think throughout the piece you had highlighted how there are two critical gaps, right? Broadly, the first set of critical gaps was technology, and the second set of gaps was in policy, right? So, if I wanted to focus on the technology part of the gaps primarily and narrow in on the satellite itself. So, I think in the piece you had highlighted that the satellite that was used in this particular oil spill was ISRO's EOS 4 satellite,
Yeah.
and specific that used a sensor called a synthetic aperture radar SAR sensor. And I remember that you had highlighted that this sensor, although it could detect the oil spill, this satellite was itself maybe is not ideal as a solution because it's not specifically built for tracking oil spills, and it is a general purpose use satellite. So if you could go a little more into that and tell us why it would be beneficial to have, a satellite specifically tracking oil spills, and what would be the technology that such a satellite would use and how that would be different from synthetic aperture radar, then I would love to hear.
Yeah. So to start with, the synthetic aperture radar, or the sensors that we call it was mostly used because it doesn't get hindered by the clouds that would be in the region. It can work in light and in the nighttime. It basically gives those impulse data which can be to understand the region. And also, I've seen a lot of times when the after effect of an oil spill, there is again the EO satellites which are used, which are actually meant for a general observation routine. And these all have different temporal resolution, which is that they go around a particular location in certain number of days, and they actually measure that particular location according to that time and light, sunlight and things like that. But the reason that we might need, or not we as country or any coastal monitoring mechanism should have specific sensors, is because, as I said, the chemicals within the petroleum fuels can vary. It might not be necessarily an oil spill. It could be some non other hazardous waste which has got into it. And to look into that, because each sensor or each sensors that are used in these satellites for the camera purpose could have different adaptability to the wavelength of different objects. For example, a leaf is visible to us in green color is because of the wavelength, the best wavelength that it absorbs and then it reflects. And these vary according to that. So if we don't even know which exact oil is out there, which exact chemical is out there, the mitigation strategy could become tricky because we might be using a general method which is there, or general SOP which is there, which might not work at times for a certain kind of disaster. And that is why it would be better to have a specific monitoring satellite which goes around, or at least there are also techniques done in other countries where you can even have these drone surveys as they are coming up. You don't have to probably need a satellite up in the orbital levels to monitor these coastal areas. So if there are drones which could have actually much better resolution, could give much better data when it comes to techniques that would be used to control the oil spill, or even at least remove the wreckage that has been caused, because there are already countries doing these very well. It's not a very innovative thing that we are claiming to do. For example, Japan has actually done quite a very good job when it comes to this meteorological monitoring, also because they're quite prone to these kind of disasters, and much more when it comes to the climate impact itself. But because they've done that, it is mostly that we only have to adopt these technologies which are already available, and make it as indigenous or domestic, because the condition could vary according to the regions. So if it is good enough, you can have the NOAA data to resolve the issue, good enough. But you might never know how the satellites would not know the regional intricacies of Indian coastlines. And that is why it's always better to have models which are suited to your region, which are suited to your weather conditions, and even the trade or shipments that happens across over a day, over a time, and all.
Thank you so much for that answer, Swati. I think that was very informative. But if you could explain for the benefit of our audience a little deeper into what NOAA's GNOME is, I think the general NOAA
Yeah.
operational modeling environment, what it is, how we used it, and why a little more detail into why we should develop our own models, why the Arabian Sea landscape is different from where the GNOME was trained, all of that. Maybe if you could go into a
Yeah.
little deeper.
So interesting thing that NOAA is basically the ocean and atmospheric observational body that was created by the US. It was created in 1970s, and bit of history into that fact is the reason for creating a body which looks into everything, like which looks into weather as well as these ocean related data, was because around in 1969 they had an oil disaster which happened, I think, in Santa Barbara. So, which again caused quite a economic loss to the station. And since US probably was understanding that its Gulf was actually prone to these kind of oil spills because of the kind of trade that was happening, and because they were only that it was only going to increase in future. So again in 1989 they had a tanker explosion which caused fumes, fires, and all kind of fuel discharge into the ocean. And then, of course, the Deepwater Horizon incident, which is, I think, the biggest oil spill or damage that has been happened in the US history until now, and that was in 2010. So it was actually separate bodies for atmosphere monitoring, weather monitoring, ocean monitoring. All of these came together, and US was like, we'll have one body to take care of all of this, and it has been doing a pretty good job. It has gotten its own dedicated satellites just for marine weather monitoring and marine features monitoring. It's not just the temperature. There are things like sea levels. There are things like the wave momentum movements. For example, when we hear about cyclones, right? So we hear that, okay, the cyclone has moved from this point on the Arabian Sea to this point, and this is its speed. So what NOAA has basically done is it has these buoys, kind of recording systems which are put all across the ocean bases, and that is how it detects how when a wave speed changes from one particular point to the next particular point. NOAA gets the data on how much, in what kind of speed is this moving, and that is how they predict the cyclone movement happening towards a coast. And that is how we are able to now at least understand that, okay, this is reaching in this many hours, and then it will reach the coast, and then it will die. And the same thing happens for the ship monitoring also with NOAA. So there are, to name out a few sensor, there's something called Aqua, Terra. I wouldn't get into the details of these, but all of them have sensors which can capture different wavelengths, which can capture altitudes, which can capture of basically the waves which come across, and depths of a sea level at particular points, so that you know if the ship is safe enough to reach the port and things like that. So it is quite dedicated in that sense. And interestingly, even Indian Meteorological Department, which is another weather monitoring organization of India, and the INCOIS, which I mentioned earlier, even they depend on these sensors and databases provided by NOAA. So it has been doing a pretty well job, but as I said, to the regional intricacies, there could be variations which happen all the time. And that was the reason other countries like Japan, Australia, another very good example of marine monitoring, which does. And even smaller countries like the Nordic countries, Germany, for example, they have databases which actually tell how much quantity a ship is carrying which is coming near the coast, and what is the distance, and so that they can, if any disaster happens, right, they have a mitigation strategy in mind, how much forces should go in to control those things. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Swati, for those wonderful responses to some very tricky and challenging questions that Tanmay had posed to you. So, based on your responses, what I understand is two broad takeaways. First, that there is a issue with depending primarily on ISRO's multi-purpose satellite, and second, there is a need for India-specific modeling instead of relying on generalized models that are not suited for Indian context, which are developed elsewhere, right? And you gave the NOAA example from the US. So now let's move to a different aspect of this conversation, right? The policy part, strategy part. And you've also written about India's national oil spill disaster contingency plan. So my sense is that the two incidents we have had very recently off the coast of Kerala are not rare, right? They have happened in the past, many accidents like this, and they'll continue to happen in the future because maritime shipping industry is only going to multiply, right? In terms of the sheer diversity of ships that they operate and the absolute number of ships that sail around the oceans and the high seas. So my sense is this is only set to increase. Now, with that, do you think there is a need to comprehensively revise the oil spill disaster contingency plan? Do you think there are certain lacunas in it that need urgent attention? And if you were to suggest this revision, what would be some broad pillars or broad items to do this revision?
Also, just to add one thing, one of the states in India which is actually looking into, these things like the coastal monitoring and is actually taking initiatives is Gujarat. So they're actually trying out systems like basically ground stations, not just rely on the satellite data. And these are also remote sensing data itself, but basically are surely trying some initiatives out there. But and I think after the two incidents in the Kerala coast, even the Kerala government a few weeks ago said that it will be coming up with a state dedicated oil contingency plan, which I think if is implemented would be a good move, because it's not that you don't have the forces, you already have your SDMA in force, you have your police forces in place, and of course there are certain Indian military forces in every state because of their transfers and things like that. So if a plan could come up would be great. And I think maybe because these incidents, as I said, it is like 7 or 8 incidents in a year, doesn't seem too much as a number. And maybe we're not, analyzing the impact of one such incident on the biodiversity and livelihood and things like that itself. Maybe that has what delayed things in countries and probably the organizations also, because we have so many dedicated things, like we have conventions like marine pollution, the Marpol convention, I think India is a member of that. And then of course there is the international law for sea, which takes care of all these parameters when it comes to seas, international borders, and then which trade ship is who is accountable for what actions happen in the sea. But the thing is, there's a lot of voluntary aspect to it. For example, these ships themselves can have these monitoring devices on them, right? But since it's voluntary, even now, I think less than 50% of the ships get attached to it. I had talked to somebody from the Worldwide Ferry Institute, and that was their major claim. It's like even the commercial ships, right, which could actually benefit from having these any forecast kind of data which they could get by installing these weather monitoring small stations and antennas and things like that on a ship. They don't really they are not really adopting it, and since it's voluntary and not mandatory, I think that's the major hesitant, like why make that investment. And so one would be, if things like these could be made mandatory to some level, like the safety precaution basis on at least some level. And second is the accountability issue, right?
So I think
Yeah.
before you proceed to the accountability issue, just a bit on the enforcement part, right? The reason I, in this whole conversation, specifically avoided even venturing into the part, how can we, have ships better regulated or certain safety practices being followed by ships. The reason I avoided that part and focused more on what India can do to tackle this, right? So the framing was this is going to happen, right? And that India needs to tackle it better. The reason I did that framing is my sense or my understanding of the global maritime shipping industry is that you have ships that are built by company A in country X, which are flagged by some other country, which can be Liberia or which
Yeah.
can be something in the Central Americas, right? Panama and so on. And then you have these ships crewed by, so the crew is coming from many different countries, including Philippines, India, a lot of other Asian geographies or maybe African geographies. And then these ships are sailing in high seas, in oceans, in exclusive economic zones, in so many different regulatory spaces, so to speak, where
Yeah.
different laws apply, right? And sometimes they're even sailing through very contested regions as well, where it's not sure which regulations will apply or not. So
Yeah.
when you have such a, and again, I'm not even going into the complexity of the ships themselves, right? Some of these ships are many decades old. They have
Mm.
not been retrofitted well. They have not been rehauled with the idea of safety or mitigating fuel spillage issues and so on. So, when you have such an industry, it's very difficult to enforce anything on them to minimize oil spillage. Maybe you can go via the shipping, you have these associations of shippers, right? Many different industry bodies are there. Maybe you can bring in some guidelines there, enforce it via that route, and so on. Maybe IEMO can do something on that front by bringing some sort of code or convention on it, or strengthening the existing codes and conventions. That is why I think I wanted to clarify this to our listeners also, why the framing was specifically towards India. But great point, Swati. So can you move to the accountability part now?
Yeah. So again, accountability, if the case again goes to the high court, and then there is the whole judicial proceeding which has to come through, which might I'm not saying it would surely, but at least might delay the compensation, the economical compensation that could come through by the commercial bodies, right? Since if it is a you have recorded that it is a commercial ship which has caused the oil spill, there has to be that mandatory accountability brought onto that organization, or the which runs the ship basically, to ensure the compensation comes into place. If that goes through multiple layers of bureaucracy and judiciary, it might delay, and that might kind of not give that seriousness to that incident or the disaster itself. Because if how to say this, okay, if the contingency plan which any country frames or any state frames, it is also kind of necessary to include the accountability mechanism within that. For example, if it is made by a commercial ship, if it is made by another country's ship, how do you ensure who is responsible? Is it the manufacturer? Is it the transporter? And things like that. At least put it out in some terms so that the organizations which are responsible to look into these have a way to go about it, right? For example, now, since as we said, the state doesn't have a contingency plan, how do you go about it? You just go to the reactionary thing, then bring all your forces which are there and do what is probably known through experience rather than actually having a designed system of going through these accountability mechanism, getting hold of these people. Because most of the times what happens, if it is I'm guessing a smaller commercial ship, right, it might not be the 1,000 ton volumes, but if you are putting these people into the custodies which could be possible, they might not really know what even to do about it. And if it was happened, for example, if any smaller oil leaks happen through these ferries, as we don't know how it would happen in future, but if there are multiple ferries which are actually run by just fishermen who take it into the seas, if you don't know how to treat a massive ship differently and a smaller one differently, you will never have a more equity based model. You will, and it might not be even effective in that sense. So that would be one. And there could be a few technical improvements which could come into then, because I feel like unless it is bought into a policy or bought into a document format, it will be difficult to think about it seriously. For example, to get a budget to these disaster management things. For example, it took quite a few years for India to understand the importance of heat wave and then create a whole definition and then get the state allocations, budget allocations, and other different measures to resolve that. So something like that would be required in this case too. Given that India actually has such a long coastline, it has so much of trade happening through it. So yeah.
Yeah, I have one more question on this, right? So you spoke about how we need to move from being reactive to being proactive when it comes to cleaning up oil spills and everything. And I want to connect this to our initial part of the discussion, right? When we spoke about the ancillary impacts that oil spills have on livelihoods and other things. So, and I think you mentioned this in your op-ed as well, and I just wanted to touch base upon this with you. Does our current policy system provide solutions for these ancillary impacts? Like, for example, if there is an oil spill that happens, and because of the oil spill, let's say fish population in that area goes down for a significant amount of time, does the central government provide or any form of, or any government for that matter, provide compensation to the fishermen in that area? So when it comes to all of these, ancillary impacts, do we have policy tailored to solve for these? Do we have policy to maybe, help the biodiversity come back after an oil spill, or is our, policy currently only focused on cleaning up the oil spill and nothing else? So any thoughts on this?
Interesting. So, yes, there is a certain kind of compensation which goes into place, but it's mostly done by the state itself who's responsible, because the fishermen or the fishery sector in that sense comes under the state list or state's responsibility, right? So, certain kind of compensation goes into it. But to put just a economical lens, right? If there is a state compensating the fishermen who are like suddenly impacted due to the oil spill, it's again coming from the taxpayers' money, who have not really contributed to the incident or the disaster itself. So, because the compensation from the accountable things would be delayed, right, to reach to the state and then disperse, so much of complexity is there. So, the most of this compensation does happen, at least as I have read in the news in Kerala. So, yes, they do get compensated, but nothing as a dedicated system. And again, another thing is there is no overtime monitoring, right? For example, I am guessing because there are so something which recently goes famous is the microplastic nodules and everything, which are causing a lot of marine pollution, and they are just there is so much of cleaning, ocean cleaning programs also going on. But these are plastics are basically formed from hydrocarbons, which are able to sustain in the marine environment for such a long time, right? So, if we are also removing the oil which is visible, which is there on the surface of the water, good enough. But to measure if that area itself is affected due to this incident which happened like 5 years ago or 10 years ago, you will need much better research, much better continuous forecast models, and data modeling based on the historical data itself, which I'm not sure is really happening. For example, currently in India, there is these flood modeling which happens, flood forecast modeling. There is things like drought monitoring. For example, as the month is March or April, the weather organizations are able to tell that there might be a drought or not. But that kind of modeling with respect to the data, which is actually available, which could be available because NOAA sensors are collecting it every day, that is something which is missing. So yes, it's not just about creating the technical capabilities and building the infrastructure. It will also be to ensure this is done as a long term mitigation strategy, right? So that if at least the prevention method shouldn't be just on for that 2 months or for the tangible or the visible impact itself. There could be a lot of invisible impacts which will need much deeper research, I'm sure.
Thank you so much, Swati, again for answering the question very well. So the sense is that, the last response that you gave also pointed towards a larger problem of pollution in marine environments. And I think you spoke about microplastics and so on. And it's not just oil spills that affect the waters around India's long coastline. It's also because of other hazardous things that these ships are carrying, and then when they're in an accident or when they catch on fire or are involved in collision or any other mishap, they also release these hazardous things into the water. So it's a much larger problem than just oil spills. And I think it's high time now that the government of India and also different states, as you rightly pointed out, should start looking at this more seriously, because what matters is not just the numbers, how many number of these incidents happen, but also the impact, as you
Yeah.
again rightly framed. So with that, we'll conclude this podcast, and I'd encourage all the listeners to send in their comments and thoughts on what they think about the oil spill issue, if they agree with Swati's criticism and suggestions to improve how India deals with this, or if they have anything out of the box as a solution. And thank you, Tannmay, for asking those brilliant questions. Thank you, everyone.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.